Welcome, dear listener, to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. I'm so glad you've joined me here tonight. Or perhaps it's early morning where you are, or a quiet afternoon. Wherever you find yourself, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, I hope you're somewhere comfortable, somewhere safe, somewhere you can simply let your mind wander through the dark corridors of history as we explore them together. Before we begin our journey tonight, if you're finding these deep dives into history's unglamorous realities helpful for rest or simply fascinating in their own right, I gently encourage you to subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it helps this strange little corner of the internet continue to exist. No pressure, of course. I'm simply grateful you're here. Tonight we're venturing into territory that exists in that fascinating borderland between myth and reality, between the stories we tell ourselves and the archaeological truths that lie buried beneath them. We're exploring Viking myths that were shockingly, disturbingly, and often brutally real. Now, I call this channel Boring History, and tonight's topic might seem anything but boring. Blood eagles and berserkers, human sacrifice and cannibalism, these are the sensational elements that dominate popular culture's obsession with the Viking Age. But here's what makes this boring history. We're not here for the entertainment value of violence. We're not here to revel in the spectacular brutality. Instead, we're going to examine these practices with the same methodical attention we might give to crop rotation techniques or pottery glazing methods. We're going to look at the evidence, the skeletal remains, the legal codes, the archaeological contexts, and understand these practices not as exciting aberrations, but as the mundane realities of a particular time and place. So settle in, get comfortable, let the day's concerns drift away. We're about to spend considerable time examining 25 different myths from the Viking Age, looking at how archaeological science and historical documentation have confirmed practices that many assumed were pure legend. Some of these confirmations are recent, discoveries from the last decade that have fundamentally changed our understanding of Viking Age society. Others have been known for generations but ignored because they complicate our preferred narratives. This will be, as always, a slow journey, a thorough journey, a methodical examination that values completeness over excitement. Let's begin. When we speak of the Viking Age, we're discussing a period that spans roughly from 793 CE, the raid on Lindisfarne that marks the conventional beginning, to 1066 CE, when Harold Hardrada died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and the Norman conquest fundamentally altered the political landscape of Northern Europe. That's 273 years, which is longer than the entire history of the United States of America. It's a span of time that saw multiple generations, significant cultural evolution, religious transformation, and technological development. Geographically, we're primarily focused on Scandinavia, modern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. But the Viking world was far more expansive than that. Viking activity stretched from Newfoundland in the west to the Caspian Sea in the east, from the Arctic Circle in the north to the Mediterranean in the south. Vikings established settlements in Iceland, Greenland, Ireland, England, Scotland, Normandy, and Russia. They served as mercenaries in Byzantium, traded in Baghdad, and possibly reached as far south as North Africa. This geographic diversity is important because not all Viking Age practices were universal. A ritual common in 9th century Norway might have been unknown in 11th century Iceland. A legal custom in Sweden might have differed significantly from Danish practices. When we discuss Viking myths and realities, we're necessarily generalizing across considerable time and space, though we'll try to be specific about regional and temporal variations when the evidence allows. The physical landscape of Scandinavia shaped these cultures in profound ways. We're talking about a region of dramatic fjords, dense forests, limited arable land, and long, brutal winters. This was an environment that made survival challenging even in good years. Resources were scarce, the growing season was short. Preservation of food through the winter months was a matter of life and death. This scarcity, this constant proximity to survival's edge, informed many of the practices we'll examine tonight. The pragmatic brutality born not of sadism but of desperation. The climate during this period was actually relatively favourable by Scandinavian standards. The medieval warm period meant slightly higher temperatures than the centuries that followed, which is partly why Norse settlements in Greenland were even possible. But relatively favourable still meant harsh conditions by most standards. Winters were still deadly. Crop failures still occurred with regularity. The sea, which provided both transportation and protein, also claimed countless lives. Maritime culture defined Viking Age Scandinavia. The sea was highway, hunting ground, battlefield and graveyard all at once. Ship technology was perhaps the most significant Scandinavian innovation of the period, allowing for both the famous raids and the less famous but more important trade networks that connected the Viking world to the broader medieval economy. Many of the practices we'll examine tonight relate directly to this maritime culture: the raiding, the trading, the mobility of populations, the exchange of enslaved people. It's also crucial to understand that this was a pre-modern society in the most fundamental sense. There was no germ theory of disease, no understanding of infection, no effective anesthesia, no antibiotics. Medical practice was a combination of observation, tradition and guesswork. Pain was managed through alcohol, certain herbs and sheer endurance. This context matters when we discuss practices that seem unimaginably cruel to modern sensibilities. The cruelty was often incidental to the ignorance. Viking Age Scandinavia was a warrior aristocracy built on agriculture, raiding, and trade, with a social structure that recognised three primary classes: the Jarls, nobility, the Carls, free farmers and craftspeople, and the Thralls, enslaved people. This social stratification was not merely economic, it was considered fundamental to the cosmic order. The Ringstula, a poem from the Poetic Edda, describes how the god Rig, Heimdall in disguise, literally fathered the three classes by sleeping with women of different stations, suggesting that social hierarchy was divinely ordained and biologically inherent. This worldview had profound implications for how Viking Age Scandinavians treated one another. If thralls were understood to be inherently inferior beings, then practices we would classify as human rights violations were simply the natural order of things. If the Jarls were inherently superior, their greater rights and freedoms were not privileges but reflections of cosmic truth. This isn't to excuse these beliefs, simply to understand that moral frameworks operate within cultural contexts, and the Viking Age operated within a fundamentally different framework than modern egalitarian societies. Religion during most of the Viking Age was what we now call Norse paganism, though that's a later Christian term. Vikings themselves would have understood their religious practices as simply the way things were done, the proper relationship between humans and the various entities that populated their cosmos: gods, giants, elves, dwarves, landvetir, land spirits, and the dead. This was a religion intimately connected to land, lineage, and social obligation. It was transactional, offerings given to gods and spirits in exchange for favourable outcomes, and it was pragmatic. Different gods handled different concerns, and you approached the appropriate deity for the appropriate problem. Sacrifice was central to Norse religious practice. The word blot referred to blood sacrifice, though offerings could also include food, drink, and valuable objects. What constituted appropriate sacrifice varied. Animals were common, but so, as we'll see tonight, were human beings under certain circumstances. The line between sacrifice and execution was often blurred, as many executions had ritual elements, and many sacrifices resembled executions. This religious landscape began shifting in the late 10th and 11th centuries as Christianity spread through Scandinavia. This wasn't a simple or peaceful transition. Conversion was often forced, sometimes at sword point. Old practices persisted alongside or beneath Christian surfaces. legal codes began incorporating Christian morality while maintaining older Norse legal concepts. This transitional period is particularly interesting because we have documentation from both pagan and Christian perspectives, allowing us to see how practices were understood differently depending on the religious framework of the observer. Viking Age law deserves particular attention because many of the practices we'll examine tonight were not criminal acts but legal procedures. Viking legal culture was complex and sophisticated, based on oral tradition, public assemblies, the thing, and careful procedural requirements. But it was also a legal culture that accepted violence as a legitimate tool for dispute resolution, that recognised slavery as lawful, and that prescribed brutal punishments for various offences. Understanding what was legal versus illegal in Viking Age society helps us understand which practices were considered normal and which were considered transgressive even by their own standards. The economic foundation of this society was mixed. Agriculture, primarily barley, oats and livestock, provided the base. Raiding brought wealth and enslaved labour. Trade connected Scandinavia to the broader medieval world, exchanging furs, amber, walrus ivory and slaves for silver, silk, spices and finished goods from the south and east. This economic system depended fundamentally on violence, both the violence of raids and the structural violence of slavery. Wealth accumulation and social advancement were intimately tied to one's capacity for violence or management of violent people. We should also understand that this was an oral culture that gradually became literate. Most of what Vikings knew, they knew through memorization, recitation and storytelling. The sagas that preserve many of these myths were written down centuries after the events they describe, often by Christian monks with incomplete understanding of pagan practices and social norms. Archaeological evidence sometimes confirms what the sagas report, sometimes contradicts them, and sometimes reveals practices the sagas never mention. This means we're often working with fragments, incomplete pictures reconstructed from material remains, legal texts, contemporary foreign accounts, and later literary sources that may or may not be reliable. Tonight's exploration rests on a simple but profound observation. The gap between myth and reality in Viking Age history is narrower than we have assumed, but the reasons for that narrowness are more disturbing than the myths themselves. For much of the 20th century, scholarship on the Viking Age existed between two extremes. On one hand, there was a tendency to dismiss saga accounts as pure literary invention, treating them as medieval fantasy rather than sources with any historical value. On the other hand, there was a nationalist tradition, particularly strong in Scandinavia and Germany, that romanticised Viking culture and either downplayed its brutal elements or reframed them as masculine virtue. Neither approach served historical truth well. What's emerged over the past few decades, particularly with advances in forensic archaeology, DNA analysis, isotope studies and other scientific techniques, is a more nuanced picture. The sagas, we now understand, often contained kernels of historical truth wrapped in layers of literary elaboration. Practices dismissed as impossible exaggerations turn out to have archaeological correlates. Legal codes preserved in later manuscripts reflect actual social practices. Contemporary foreign accounts, while biased, describe real events and customs. But here's what makes this disturbing rather than merely interesting. The practices that archaeological science has confirmed are often more systematic, more widespread, and more institutionalized than the myths suggested. The myths often presented these practices as exceptional, the blood eagle as a rare and spectacular execution method, berserkers as legendary warriors, human sacrifice as occasional ritual drama. What the evidence reveals is that these weren't exceptions but patterns. They weren't aberrations but systems. The blood eagle, as we'll see, may have been rare in its complete form, but it was part of a broader culture of torture execution that was common. Berserkers weren't legendary super warriors, but drugged fighters whose use was systematic enough to appear in multiple legal codes. Human sacrifice wasn't occasional drama, but regular practice at funerals, religious festivals, and certain legal executions. The myths captured real practices, but they often captured them as spectacular moments when the reality was routine horror. This pattern repeats across all 25 examples we'll examine tonight. The myth presents the practice as extraordinary, the evidence reveals it as ordinary, and that ordinariness is precisely what makes it boring history. The systematic, bureaucratic, everyday nature of practices that we prefer to think of as exceptional. We also need to address why these confirmations matter, beyond mere historical curiosity. Understanding that these practices were real helps us understand several important things about human nature and historical process. First, it reminds us that cultural context shapes moral frameworks profoundly. Practices that seem unthinkably cruel to us were considered normal, legal, or even virtuous in other times and places. Second, it demonstrates how material evidence can complicate or contradict literary sources, requiring us to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. Third, it shows us that the past was not moving inexorably toward our present. Viking Age Scandinavia was not a primitive stage in a progression toward modern values, but a fully realised cultural system operating under different assumptions. Finally, examining these confirmed myths helps us understand the present. Many of these practices, slavery, institutionalised violence, social stratification justified through cosmic belief systems, legal inequalities, exploitation of the vulnerable, haven't disappeared from human society. They've merely changed forms. Recognising the systematic nature of Viking Age brutality might make us more alert to the systematic nature of contemporary brutalities that we've normalised into invisibility. So as we move through these 25 chapters, we're not here to be shocked or entertained by Viking violence. We're here to understand how societies construct and maintain practices that later ages find incomprehensible. We're here to see how the archaeological and historical record reveals patterns beneath the spectacular surface of myth. And we're here, as always, to sit with uncomfortable truths long enough that they become simply facts, neither minimised nor sensationalised but understood. Now, let us turn to the specific myths and their disturbing confirmations. Chapter 1. The blood eagle was real. For decades, historians dismissed the blood eagle as pure saga invention. Too theatrical, too elaborate, too impossibly cruel to be real. The practice, as described in several sagas, involved cutting the ribs away from the spine and pulling the lungs out through the back, supposedly creating a shape resembling an eagle's wings. It seemed like medieval dark fantasy, the kind of lurid detail saga authors would invent to emphasise the wickedness of certain historical villains. After all, how could such a procedure even be performed on a living person without them immediately dying from shock or blood loss? But then archaeologists began finding something disturbing in Viking Age mass graves, particularly in England. At the Repton mass grave site, which dates to the winter of 873-874 CE, when the Viking Great Army overwintered in Derbyshire, skeletal analysis revealed something unsettling. Several individuals showed rib damage patterns consistent with the blood eagle procedure. The ribs had been cut from the spine with sharp implements. The cuts were perimortem, meaning they occurred at or very near the time of death. The positioning of the damage matched saga descriptions with uncomfortable precision. What made this truly brutal wasn't just the procedure itself, but what forensic analysis revealed about the victim's states during the execution. The skeletal trauma patterns indicated that hearts were still pumping blood when the cuts were made. The victims were alive, conscious, experiencing what must have been unimaginable agony as their torturers carefully separated rib from spine. This wasn't a quick execution with ritualised mutilation afterward. This was methodical torture designed to kill slowly while the victim remained aware. The most detailed account of a blood eagle execution comes from a Northumbrian monk who witnessed the execution of King Ella of Northumbria by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. His description, preserved in later Northumbrian chronicles, includes details that he couldn't possibly have invented. The specific sequence of cuts, the sound of the procedure, the time it took for the victim to die. For years, scholars dismissed this as fabrication, but the Repton evidence suggests the monk was describing something he actually saw. It's hard not to feel a certain revulsion when we move from myth to confirmed reality. The blood eagle remains rare in the archaeological record. We're not talking about hundreds of confirmed cases, but rather a handful of sites showing evidence of the practice. But rare doesn't mean legendary. It means the blood eagle was probably reserved for specific circumstances: enemy kings, oath breakers, men who killed their own kin. The practice was real enough to be performed, ritualized enough to be remembered, but uncommon enough that each instance was considered noteworthy. So the next time you see a television show or movie depicting the blood eagle, remember, you're not watching pure fiction. You're watching a sanitized, shortened version of something that actually happened to real human beings. The myth was real, and the reality was worse than the myth suggested. Chapter 2. They actually drank from skulls. The image of Vikings drinking mead from the skulls of their enemies has become such a cliché that most historians assumed it was pure Hollywood invention, a confusion arising from the word skål, which actually just means a drinking toast, from the Old Norse word for bowl. Surely, scholars reasoned, this was symbolic language misunderstood by later chroniclers who couldn't distinguish metaphor from literal description. After all, skulls aren't particularly functional drinking vessels. They're porous, awkwardly shaped, difficult to hold. Then archaeologists excavating burial sites on Gotland, the large Swedish island in the Baltic Sea, began finding carefully modified human skulls dating to 800–900 CE. These weren't skulls that had been casually defaced or damaged. These were skulls that had been systematically processed into functional drinking vessels. The modifications were precise and showed considerable skill. The cranial vault had been separated from the facial bones, the interior had been scraped clean, the edges had been carefully smoothed, and in several cases the rim had been reinforced with silver or copper banding to prevent cracking during use. The process of creating these skull cups would have been labour-intensive and unpleasant. First, the flesh would need to be removed, either through burial and later exhumation, or through more immediate methods we'd rather not dwell on in detail. The bone would then need to be cleaned thoroughly, as residual organic material would cause the vessel to smell unbearable. The cutting had to be precise. Too shallow, and the vessel would leak. Too deep, and it would be structurally weak. Finally, the edges needed to be polished smooth enough that they wouldn't cut the drinker's lips. This wasn't casual desecration. This was craftsmanship. Perhaps most disturbing of all, DNA analysis and isotope studies on several of these skull cups revealed an unexpected pattern. The victims were often relatives or honoured enemies rather than random captives. In some cases, the genetic markers suggested family relationships between the deceased whose skull became a cup and the person in whose grave the cup was buried. This reframes the practice entirely. Not mere trophy-taking, but something more complex, possibly related to inheritance practices or the desire to keep deceased relatives close in the afterlife. A chieftain's grave excavated in 2009, near Uppsala, contained 3 skull cups arranged carefully among his other grave goods. All 3 showed the same careful preparation. All 3 had silver rim banding. Analysis suggested that the skulls came from individuals who died in their 30s, were generally healthy before death, and died from blade trauma to the neck, suggesting execution or battle deaths rather than disease or accident. The chieftain had gone into the afterlife with 3 carefully prepared skull cups from 3 carefully selected individuals. What this tells us is that the practice was neither universal nor casual, but it was real, and it followed patterns. Certain individuals, for specific reasons, had their skulls transformed into drinking vessels. These vessels were valuable enough to be included in elite burials. They were crafted with enough care to last. and they represented some aspect of Viking Age social relationships that we can only partially reconstruct from the material evidence. Modern society has its own version of trophy culture, the photographs, the souvenirs, the memorabilia we keep to mark important experiences or victories. But we rarely transform the actual bodies of our enemies into functional objects. The Vikings did, and the archaeological evidence confirms that when the sagas mention skull cups, they're describing a real practice, not a poetic flourish. Chapter 3. Human sacrifice at funerals was standard. The notion that Vikings performed human sacrifice at high-status funerals has never been entirely dismissed by historians, largely because of the famous account by Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab traveller who witnessed a ship burial on the Volga River. His description is detailed and disturbing. A young slave woman volunteered to accompany her deceased master, was richly prepared, and was ultimately strangled and stabbed during the burial ceremony. For years, the question was whether Ibn Fadlan's account described an exceptional event or a standard practice, and whether his description, filtered through his own cultural perspective and potential language barriers, was accurate. Archaeological excavations over the past few decades have provided a clear answer. Human sacrifice at funerals was not exceptional. It was standard practice for elite burials throughout the Viking Age. The Oseberg ship burial, one of the most famous Viking Age archaeological sites, contained not just 2 high-status women, but also the remains of at least 15 other individuals, servants, thralls, and possibly relatives, who were sacrificed as part of the funeral rites. The physical evidence leaves little room for interpretation. The excavation revealed a pattern repeated at multiple high-status Viking Age burials. Broken necks consistent with hanging or strangulation. Blade marks on vertebrae consistent with decapitation or throat cutting. And careful positioning of bodies suggesting ritualized placement rather than casual disposal. These weren't people who happened to die around the same time and were conveniently buried together. These were deliberate killings performed as part of funeral ceremonies, with specific methods and specific purposes. What makes this particularly disturbing is the evidence regarding the victims' states leading up to their deaths. At several burial sites, including the famous Flakstad grave in Norway, bioarchaeological analysis has revealed the presence of various substances in the victims' remains, compounds consistent with henbane, alcohol, and possibly other intoxicants. This matches Ibn Fadlan's description of the slave woman being given copious amounts of alcohol before her death. But here's the question that haunts this evidence. Were the victims drugged to ease their passing, or to prevent resistance? The positioning of some remains suggests struggle despite the intoxication. Ibn Fadlan's account includes a detail that seemed almost too horrible to believe. The old woman he calls the Angel of Death, who orchestrated the sacrifice, apparently performed this role regularly at multiple funerals. The archaeological pattern supports this. The consistency of methods across multiple sites and multiple time periods suggests professionalized roles, established procedures, inherited knowledge. This wasn't improvised violence. This was systematized ritual, probably with recognized practitioners who specialized in the proper performance of funeral sacrifices. The number of victims varied with the status of the deceased. A Carl's funeral might include no human sacrifice at all, or perhaps one thrall. A Jarl's funeral might include several. A king's funeral could involve dozens. The Repton mass grave, mentioned earlier, may represent the funeral sacrifices from multiple high-status Vikings who died during that winter. A collective burial event that required a corresponding collective sacrifice of captives and thralls. What's perhaps most revealing is that this practice was considered an honour for the sacrificed thrall in Viking Age cultural logic. Ibn Fadlan reports that the slave woman volunteered, that she was celebrated in the days leading up to her death. Whether her choice was truly free in any meaningful sense is another question entirely. How free is a choice made by an enslaved person in a society where refusing such an honour might mean a worse death or retribution against family. We can scarcely imagine a moral framework where accompanying one's owner into death is considered proper and good. But the archaeological evidence confirms that this framework existed, that it was widespread, and that it resulted in systematic killings at funerals throughout the Viking Age. Chapter 4. Berserkers were chemically induced warriors. The berserker, the frenzied warrior who fought with superhuman strength and felt no pain, has become one of the most famous Viking Age myths. For most of the modern period, historians treated berserkers as pure legend, the kind of exaggerated warrior figure that appears in the heroic literature of many cultures. The descriptions seem too fantastical. Men who could shrug off wounds that would kill normal fighters, who possess supernatural strength, who worked themselves into trances before battle. Surely these were literary inventions, metaphors for exceptional bravery or fighting skill, not descriptions of actual physiological states. But as toxicologists and medical historians began examining the descriptions more carefully, patterns emerged. The symptoms described in the sagas and legal codes match quite precisely with the effects of certain psychoactive substances that would have been available in Viking Age Scandinavia: henbane, fly agaric mushrooms, and possibly ergot-contaminated grain. The specific combination of symptoms, dilated pupils, perceived superhuman strength, immunity to pain, difficulty distinguishing friend from foe, post-battle exhaustion or confusion, maps onto alkaloid poisoning profiles. Archaeological evidence supports the pharmacological interpretation. Several warrior burials, particularly those from Norway and Sweden, have yielded evidence of regular consumption of these substances. Residue analysis from drinking vessels found in graves shows traces of henbane alkaloids. One warrior burial from 9th century Norway contained a leather pouch with preserved remains of what appear to be dried Amanita muscaria mushrooms, the classic red-capped, white-spotted fly agaric. This wasn't decorative. This was someone's working stash. What made this truly brutal, however, was what skeletal analysis revealed about the physical toll of berserker combat. The bones tell stories of horrific injuries sustained and survived, compound fractures that healed, deep blade cuts that somehow didn't sever major vessels, evidence of continued fighting despite wounds that should have been immediately incapacitating. One berserker skeleton from Vestfold shows healed fractures to both femurs, 3 ribs, the left clavicle, and the right radius, plus evidence of multiple blade impacts to the skull that cut through to the bone but didn't kill. This individual survived injuries that would be impossible to fight through while fully conscious and feeling pain. The legal codes provide additional confirmation. Several regional law codes from the Viking Age include specific provisions regarding berserkers, treating them not as mythical figures but as recognisable social categories requiring legal regulation. The Gulathing law, for instance, includes restrictions on where berserkers can live and what they're permitted to do. The Gragas law from Iceland mentions berserkers in property dispute contexts. These aren't laws about mythical beings. These are laws about real people whose behaviour required special management. What's particularly interesting is that the berserker tradition seems to have declined sharply with Christianisation. By the 11th century, references to berserkers shift from matter-of-fact legal categorizations to literary descriptions of an increasingly distant past. This suggests that berserker practices were tied to pagan religious contexts and ritual frameworks that didn't survive the transition to Christianity, or were actively suppressed during conversion. The modern parallel is impossible to ignore. From coca leaves given to Incan warriors, to amphetamines distributed to World War II soldiers, to the various combat drugs used in more recent conflicts, the practice of chemically enhancing warriors' performance and pain tolerance has never disappeared. The Vikings were simply using the psychoactive substances available to them in their environment, applying them to the same problem that has plagued organised violence throughout human history: how to make human beings fight more effectively despite their bodies' reasonable objections to injury and death. So when the sagas describe berserkers, They're describing drugged warriors experiencing alkaloid-induced psychotic states that made them both more effective in combat and more dangerous to everyone around them. The myth was real. The mechanism was chemistry. Chapter 5. They buried people alive with the dead. Of all the funeral practices associated with Viking Age burials, perhaps none seemed more implausible to modern scholars than the accounts of a living burial. Thralls or family members who were placed alive into graves with the deceased and buried conscious. The logistics alone seemed prohibitive. How would you keep someone from escaping? Why would anyone submit to such a death voluntarily? Surely this was either misunderstood metaphor from the sagas, or exaggeration from foreign chroniclers trying to emphasise Norse paganism's barbarism for Christian audiences. The Flakstad grave in northern Norway, excavated in 2017, removed any lingering doubt. The burial contains a high-status woman in the central position, surrounded by grave goods appropriate to her status. Positioned at her feet is the skeleton of a younger woman, a thrall based on isotope analysis suggesting a different geographic origin and dietary pattern. And the thrall skeleton tells an unambiguous story. She was buried alive. Her position shows clear signs of struggle. Arms drawn up defensively, legs bent in a way inconsistent with post-mortem positioning. Soil particles were found in her nasal cavity and airway, indicating she was breathing when the earth covered her. The expression preserved in Dia. Her skull structure suggests terminal distress. The archaeological evidence for living burial appears at multiple sites across Viking Age Scandinavia and Norse colonies. What we're seeing isn't exceptional cases but a documented pattern. High-status burials sometimes include individuals who were interred alive, allowed to suffocate as the grave was sealed. The methods varied slightly by region. Some were placed in the grave before it was sealed from above. Others were sealed in burial chambers with the air supply limited but not immediately cut off, leading to slower deaths over hours rather than minutes. The suffocation markers in these remains are distinctive enough that bioarchaeologists can identify them with considerable confidence. Beyond soil in the airways, there are specific patterns of bone positioning, evidence of pre-mortem distress in bone chemistry, and in some cases preserved in exceptional preservation conditions, facial expressions and hand positions that indicate conscious experience of burial. These are not bodies carefully arranged after death. These are people who died in the process of being buried. But here's the aspect that makes this practice particularly difficult to reconcile with modern moral frameworks. Within Viking Age society, this was apparently considered an honour for the thrall. Legal codes and saga accounts suggest that being selected to accompany one's owner into death was a privilege, a demonstration of trust and importance. The logic seems to have been that the thrall would continue serving their owner in the afterlife, maintaining their status relationship into eternity. From the thrall's perspective, assuming they had internalised their culture's values, this might genuinely have been perceived as preferable to remaining alive without their owner's protection. Ibn Fadlan's account, which we've already referenced, specifically mentions that the slave woman who volunteered to accompany her master was celebrated in the days before her death, given fine clothes, and treated with unusual respect. His account describes her death as involving both strangulation and stabbing, a quicker death than simple burial. This suggests that the ritual leaders might have considered it merciful to kill the victim before burial, rather than allowing them to suffocate. Yet the archaeological evidence shows that not all victims received such mercy. Some were placed living into the grave and covered with earth while conscious. The question of coerced choice haunts this evidence. How voluntary is a decision made by someone who legally has no autonomy, who exists entirely at the whim of their owner, who has been raised in a society that tells them their purpose is to serve even unto death? We can acknowledge that some thralls might have genuinely accepted this fate, while also recognising the profound structural coercion that shaped their acceptance. Chapter 6, Viking dental work, was surprisingly advanced and agonising. When? Archaeologists first discovered Viking Age skeletons with elaborately filed teeth in Swedish burial sites. The initial assumption was that these were post-mortem modifications, something done to the bodies after death as part of funeral rites. The patterns were too precise, too uniform, too deliberately decorative to have been performed on living people. Surely no one would voluntarily undergo such a procedure without anaesthesia. The pain would be unbearable. The infection risk would be catastrophic. This had to be mortuary practice, not dental work performed on the living. But as more examples accumulated, over 130 individuals across multiple sites in Sweden, primarily from the Viking trading centre at Berka, patterns emerged that contradicted the post-mortem hypothesis. The healing patterns around some of the grooves indicated that the filing occurred years before death. The wear patterns on the filed teeth showed continued use after modification. The distribution of individuals with filed teeth, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly of warrior age and status, suggested this was a practice associated with specific social roles or identities among the living, not a general burial custom. The procedure itself would have been extraordinarily painful. Using stone tools, probably fine-grained sandstone or similar abrasive materials, horizontal grooves were carefully filed into the front teeth, usually the incisors and canines. The grooves were deep, often cutting through the enamel into the dentin layer beneath. This would have been excruciatingly sensitive work, as dentin contains nerve endings. There was no effective anaesthesia beyond perhaps large quantities of alcohol, or potentially henbane preparations. The filing would have taken multiple sessions, as the work had to be precise to create the parallel horizontal lines that characterise the modification. What made this truly brutal wasn't just the initial procedure, but the aftermath. The exposed dentin would have been permanently sensitive to temperature changes. Infections would have been common. Dental abscesses appear with high frequency in individuals with filed teeth. One skeleton from Uppsala shows particularly severe consequences. 7 teeth with horizontal groove modifications and chronic jaw abscesses that ultimately formed a fistula draining through the cheek. This individual lived with constant facial infection for what skeletal analysis suggests was several years before death. Yet the teeth remained filed, the decorative pattern maintained despite the medical consequences. The purpose of this practice remains debated. Some scholars suggest it was a warrior initiation ritual, marking men who had completed certain rites of passage. Others propose it identified membership in specific warrior bands or brotherhoods. Still others argue it may have been a pain cult practice, deliberate suffering as a demonstration of toughness and endurance. The pattern of filing, always horizontal, lines, usually 3 to 7 grooves, sometimes with red pigment rubbed into the grooves to make them more visible, suggests this was a recognised aesthetic with social meaning, not random self-mutilation. What's particularly interesting is the geographic distribution. This practice appears almost exclusively in Swedish Viking Age contexts, particularly associated with trading centres and warrior burial sites. It doesn't appear in Norway or Denmark with any regularity, and it doesn't appear in Norse colonies abroad. This was a specifically Swedish phenomenon, possibly associated with particular warrior traditions or social movements that didn't spread to other Scandinavian regions. Modern body modification practices, piercings, tattoos, scarification, similarly involve deliberate pain for aesthetic or social signalling purposes. But we have anaesthesia, antibiotics, and sterile procedures. The Vikings who filed their teeth had none of these advantages. They endured the pain, accepted the infection risk, and lived with permanent dental sensitivity, because the social meaning of the modification was worth the physical cost. The skeletal evidence doesn't lie. They really did this, and they did it while alive. Chapter 7. They actually burned thralls in house fires. Among the more disturbing passages in medieval Icelandic legal codes and sagas are casual references to house burning as a method of execution, particularly for thralls accused of crimes or for disposing of unwanted enslaved people, during hardship periods. For years, scholars debated whether these references described actual practices or were literary exaggerations of the kind that populate saga literature. After all, deliberately burning people alive in buildings seemed both unnecessarily cruel and economically wasteful, destroying valuable property, both the thrall and the structure, in the process. Excavations at Hofstadr in northern Iceland removed any ambiguity about whether this practice occurred. The site contains a large turf-walled hall dating to the Viking Age, and within its remains lies archaeological evidence of a deliberate fire that killed multiple individuals trapped inside. The burn patterns are inconsistent with accidental fire. The intensity was too great, the accelerant patterns too obvious. More tellingly, analysis of the door area shows that it had been barricaded from the outside. Whoever was inside couldn't escape because someone outside had ensured they couldn't. The skeletal remains inside the burned hall at Hofstadr tell their story with devastating clarity. 3 individuals, all adults based on bone development, all showing isotope signatures consistent with thrall status, meaning they were likely not native Icelanders but captured or traded from elsewhere. Their positions at the time of death are revealing, not clustered near the blocked door as you might expect if they had tried desperately to escape, but rather distributed through the space in positions suggesting they had been overcome by smoke before the fire reached full intensity. This matches what fire forensic specialists would expect from a turf structure fire. The thick smoke filling the space first, causing unconsciousness, then the flames consuming the structure more slowly than a wooden building would burn. What made this practice particularly horrifying wasn't just the method of death, but its legal context. This was not murder in Viking Age Icelandic law. This was a permitted form of execution for thralls who had committed certain offences, or in some cases a legally acceptable method of property disposal during winter famine periods when feeding enslaved people became economically impossible. Court records from the period immediately after Iceland's conversion to Christianity document multiple cases where house burning of thralls was discussed matter-of-factly as a household management decision comparable to slaughtering excess livestock before winter. The practicalities of the procedure reveal systematic thinking about the process. Turf houses, while difficult to burn accidentally, could be made to burn very hot with proper preparation. Evidence from Hofstadr and similar sites suggests the use of accelerants, animal fat, dried grass, possibly lamp oil. The structures were sealed carefully, not just the main door but any smoke holes or ventilation gaps. The goal was to ensure death by smoke inhalation before the victims could escape through gaps in the burning walls. This was methodical execution, not impulsive violence. One saga account describes a household burning where a thrall woman and her 2 children were locked in a storage structure that was then set ablaze during a particularly harsh winter. The saga presents this without moral commentary, as simply something that happened. The household was facing starvation. The thralls consumed food without producing sufficient value, and the decision was made. The modern archaeological record shows that such passages weren't exceptional literary inventions. They were describing practices that occurred with enough regularity to leave multiple archaeological traces. We can scarcely imagine treating people as disposable property, to be destroyed when inconvenient, like damaged furniture taken out for burning. But the combination of legal codes, saga references, and archaeological evidence confirms that house burning of thralls occurred in Viking Age Iceland and Scandinavia. The myth was real. The banality was worse than the brutality. Chapter 8. Children were exposed to die regularly. Infant exposure, the practice of abandoning newborns to die, appears throughout ancient and medieval literature as a practice attributed to various barbaric peoples. When saga literature and medieval Icelandic law codes mention child exposure as an accepted practice in pre-Christian Viking Age society, many scholars assumed this was either Christian propaganda designed to emphasize paganism's cruelty or misunderstanding of rare emergency situations being presented as common practice. Surely the reasoning went, most parents throughout history have loved their children and wouldn't abandon viable infants to die. But the Gragas law codes, compiled in the 12th century but preserving earlier legal traditions, are disturbingly specific about the practice. They outline a precise protocol. After birth, the father had 3 days to decide whether to accept the child into the family. If he chose not to accept the child, due to visible disability, suspected illegitimacy, resource scarcity, or simply not wanting another mouth to feed, the infant could be taken to a remote location and left to die from exposure. This wasn't described as criminal behaviour requiring justification. This was described as a legal right of the household head. Archaeological evidence supports the practice's reality and suggests it may have been even more common than legal codes indicate. At designated exposure sites across Iceland and Scandinavia, archaeologists have found concentrations of newborn skeletal remains showing consistent patterns. The infants died within 48 hours of birth based on bone development markers. They show no signs of violent death, no blade marks, no blunt force trauma. They died from exposure, hypothermia in cold months, dehydration in warmer months, predation by animals attracted to the sound of crying infants. The distribution of these remains at specific sites suggests that certain locations were known and used repeatedly for this purpose. One particularly heartbreaking discovery came from an exposure site in northern Iceland. The skeleton of a newborn, probably less than 24 hours old, with the desiccated remains of the umbilical cord still attached. The infant had been placed on bare ground with no wrapping, no shelter, no provision for survival. The placement was careful, not tossed aside but laid out almost formally, suggesting this wasn't done in panic but as a deliberate procedurally correct abandonment. The archaeological context dated the remains to the late 10th century, just before Iceland's conversion to Christianity. Statistical modelling based on archaeological evidence, combined with demographic analysis of skeletal populations and historical population estimates, suggests that somewhere between 20 and 30% of viable births may have been exposed during the Viking Age in Iceland and parts of Scandinavia. This wasn't rare. This wasn't exceptional. This was demographic management in a resource-scarce environment, where household survival sometimes required impossible choices, or what were framed as choices within a moral system that didn't recognise newborns as full persons until formally accepted by the father. The practice appears to have ended relatively abruptly with Christianisation. Christian law codes explicitly prohibited child exposure, defining it as murder and attaching severe penalties. The archaeological record shows a sharp decline in newborn remains at exposure sites after the early 11th century in Iceland, and slightly earlier in Scandinavia proper. This suggests that while the practice was normalised within Norse pagan ethical frameworks, it couldn't survive contact with Christian doctrine about the soul's presence from conception and the moral status of infants. Modern societies still grapple with questions about reproductive autonomy, parental obligations, and resource allocation around children. But we don't typically frame these questions as whether to expose already born infants to die. The Viking Age did, and the archaeological evidence confirms that they didn't just frame the question theoretically, they answered it practically thousands of times over, with newborn bodies left in designated places to die alone in the dark. Chapter 9. The Utiligur, Outlaws, really were hunted for sport. The concept of outlawry in Viking Age society has always been recognised by historians as a serious legal punishment, but the full implications of what it meant to be utlaga, outside the law, were often softened in modern retellings. The standard description suggests that outlaws were simply exiled, forced to leave their communities but otherwise left alone to survive as best they could in Iceland's uninhabited interior or other remote regions. The reality documented in both legal codes and archaeological evidence was considerably more brutal. Full outlaws had no legal protection whatsoever and could be killed by anyone without legal consequence, and they frequently were. The legal codes are explicit about this. A person declared utläger at a thing, assembly, lost all legal rights. Their property was forfeit. Their family ties were dissolved. Any contracts or obligations involving them became void. And most significantly, anyone who encountered them could kill them without penalty. In fact, in some cases, killing an outlaw was considered a civic duty. The sagas present this not as exceptional violence, but as routine social maintenance, comparable to culling dangerous animals. But were people actually killed under these provisions, or was the threat itself sufficient deterrence? Skeletal evidence from remote areas of Iceland and Scandinavia provides disturbing confirmation that outlaws were indeed hunted and killed. Remains found in caves, ravines, and other marginal locations show patterns consistent with what we might expect from people trying to survive while being actively hunted. These skeletons show perimortem trauma from arrows, blade wounds, and in several cases injuries consistent with being run down by horses or dogs. The remains are typically isolated, single individuals or occasionally pairs, rather than the communal burials typical of the period. They show no evidence of proper burial rites. They were simply left where they fell. One particularly revealing find came from a lava cave in southwestern Iceland. The skeleton of an adult male dated to the mid-10th century showed multiple arrow wounds. 3 arrows had struck from different angles, suggesting multiple attackers or a sustained hunt. The individual had survived long enough after the initial wounds to take shelter in the cave, where he ultimately died from blood loss and infection. Isotope analysis suggested he was native Icelandic, and the quality of his remaining possessions, a broken sword, fragments of good quality clothing, indicated he had been a person of some status before his outlawry. What makes this practice particularly chilling is that it wasn't random mob violence, but systematized legal killing. Court documents and saga accounts describe the economic incentives involved. While outlaws' property was officially forfeit to whoever brought the case against them, there were often rewards or bounties offered for proof of an outlaw's death. In some cases, families paid hunters to ensure that their outlawed relative was killed, rather than surviving somewhere to potentially cause future trouble. The line between legal execution and bounty hunting essentially disappeared. The saga of Grettir Asmundarson, one of Iceland's most famous outlaw narratives, describes his years living as an outlaw and the various attempts to hunt and kill him. For generations, scholars treated this saga as heroic fiction, an entertaining adventure story with little historical basis. But the archaeological pattern of outlaw remains matches the saga's descriptions with uncomfortable accuracy. Men living in caves and rough shelters, dying from wounds inflicted by multiple attackers, left unburied in remote locations. This reminds us that social death, exclusion from legal protection and community membership, has historically been a precursor to physical death in many societies. The outlaw system wasn't rehabilitation or even simple exile. It was a death sentence carried out gradually by any community member willing to do the killing. The myth of being hunted for sport wasn't quite accurate. It was hunted for social order, for bounties, for civic duty, which is somehow worse. Chapter 10. Viking women could own thralls and order killings. Modern popular culture's image of Viking women has swung between two extremes. Either they were chattel with no power, or they were all shield maidens fighting alongside men as equals. The reality documented in archaeological and legal evidence is more complex and in some ways more disturbing than either stereotype. Elite Viking women held considerable legal and economic power, including the power to own, sell and kill enslaved people. The assumption that women in historical patriarchal societies were always relatively powerless compared to men breaks down when we examine the specific structures of Viking Age hierarchy, where gender sometimes mattered less than class status. The Oseberg ship burial provides one of the clearest examples of this reality. This famous burial contains 2 women, one elderly, one middle-aged, along with the remains of at least 15 other individuals who were sacrificed as part of the burial rites. The grave goods include an elaborately carved wooden post that archaeologists have identified as an overseer's rod, a symbol of authority over household thralls. The woman buried with this rod, almost certainly the primary occupant of the grave, had authority over a significant number of enslaved people during her life, and that authority extended to determining who would be killed at her funeral. Similar findings appear at multiple high-status female burials across Viking Age Scandinavia. Grave goods in these burials often include keys, symbols of household authority, along with other indicators of control over substantial household resources, including thralls. Legal codes confirm that women who inherited property or managed households during their husbands' absences had full authority over enslaved people, including the right to punish, sell, or in certain circumstances execute them. Gender didn't exempt women from participation in the violence of slavery. What makes this particularly unsettling to modern sensibilities is the specific documentation of women ordering executions in saga literature, which archaeological patterns suggest reflects actual practices rather than literary invention. The sagas record women ordering particularly creative and cruel executions of thralls who had offended them or failed in their duties. These aren't presented as exceptional women acting unnaturally, but as elite women exercising their legitimate authority. One well-documented example comes from the saga of Ord the Deep-Minded, a powerful woman who settled in Iceland and is described as owning numerous thralls, several of whom she had executed for various infractions. The archaeological record of female-owned thrall burials shows patterns consistent with systematic exploitation. At several sites, skeletal remains of thralls buried near elite women show evidence of hard physical labour, inadequate nutrition, and in some cases, perimortem trauma suggesting violent death. DNA and isotope analysis confirms that many of these thralls were foreign-born, captured in raids or purchased through trade networks, and experienced significant dietary and health decline after their enslavement. The women who owned them were participating fully in the economic system that depended on violence and exploitation. This challenges comfortable narratives about historical gender relations, where we imagine women as necessarily more compassionate or less capable of cruelty than men. Elite Viking women had power within their social system, and they used that power in the same ways elite men did, including the power to coerce labour, inflict punishment and order deaths. The structural position of enslaver transcended gender. A woman who owned thralls had infinitely more power than a male thrall, and she exercised that power through the same mechanisms of violence and threat that male slaveholders used. So the next time you see media representations of Viking women, remember, some of them were indeed powerful, but their power wasn't exercised in resistance to Viking Age social structures. It was exercised through those structures, and those structures depended fundamentally on slavery maintained through violence. Gender equality and oppression is still oppression. The archaeological evidence leaves no room for romanticisation. Chapter 11. They actually ate their enemies. Sometimes. Cannibalism accusations have been levelled at virtually every barbaric group throughout history, usually by their enemies as a form of propaganda designed to emphasise their otherness and justify violence against them. When saga literature and foreign chronicles mention Norse cannibalism, most modern scholars assumed this was precisely such propaganda. Christian writers attempting to make pagans seem as monstrous as possible, or saga authors adding shocking details for narrative effect. After all, there was no practical reason for Vikings to eat human flesh when they had access to fish, livestock and trade networks for food. Then came the excavation at Rusering in Sweden, which complicated this comfortable dismissal. The site, dated to the 10th century, contained human skeletal remains, showing butchery marks identical to those found on animal bones processed for food consumption. The cuts were in the right places, along major muscle groups, at joint articulations, showing clear disarticulation patterns. The bones showed evidence of being broken to extract marrow. Some showed burning consistent with roasting. The butchery was skilled, methodical, and absolutely consistent with food processing, rather than simple dismemberment or defleshing for other purposes. Context matters enormously here. This wasn't evidence of routine cannibalism or culturally accepted anthropophagy. The Rösering find dates to a period of significant hardship in the region. Crop failures recorded in multiple sources, probable famine conditions. The processed human remains were intermixed with heavily utilised animal bones showing similar extreme processing, including usually discarded parts being consumed. This appears to be survival cannibalism, desperate people eating anything available during starvation conditions, not cultural practice. However, there's also suggestive evidence for what we might call ritual or medicinal cannibalism in specific circumstances. Several saga accounts mention warriors consuming portions of particularly valiant enemies to absorb their courage or strength. While these accounts were long dismissed as pure mythology, the pattern appears across enough independent sources to suggest some underlying practice. Archaeological evidence is ambiguous, but not entirely absent. Occasional human bone fragments in context suggesting consumption that don't fit the profile of starvation cannibalism. Perhaps most disturbing are the hints in accounts from the Vinland expeditions of possible cannibalism of indigenous peoples encountered in North America. The sagas mention violent encounters with Skraelings, the Norse term for indigenous Americans, and some passages have been interpreted as obliquely referring to consumption of bodies. The evidence is far from conclusive, and these passages could be misinterpreted metaphor or simple cruelty being described in terms that later readers misunderstood. But given what we now know about survival practices during extreme conditions, complete dismissal seems premature. What the archaeological evidence clearly shows is that cannibalism occurred in Viking Age Scandinavia under specific circumstances, primarily extreme famine. What it suggests but cannot definitively prove is that small-scale ritual consumption may have occurred in certain contexts, possibly related to beliefs about absorbing enemies' qualities. What it does not show is widespread cultural cannibalism as a normal practice. This wasn't a cannibal society, but it was a society where cannibalism could and did occur when circumstances became desperate enough. This reminds us that survival ethics operate differently under extreme duress. Most human societies have taboos against cannibalism, but most have also practiced it when the alternative was death by starvation. The Vikings weren't unique in this. They were simply human beings facing the same impossible choices that humans in extremis have faced throughout history. The myth of Viking cannibalism was mostly false, except when environmental conditions made it devastatingly true. Chapter 12. Nithing poles were real curses with legal weight. The Nidstung, or nithing pole, appears repeatedly in saga literature as a powerful magical curse, a horse skull mounted on a pole carved with runes and erected facing an enemy's home to bring destruction upon them. For most of modern scholarship, this seemed like clear mythological invention, the kind of dramatic magical practice that saga authors would include for narrative colour, but that couldn't possibly have been real. How could a carved pole with a skull actually harm anyone? How could such a practice have legal recognition in a functioning legal system? Then archaeologists excavated a farm site in Iceland that had been abandoned suddenly in the late 10th century and found something remarkable. A preserved horse skull mounted on a wooden post, carved with runic inscriptions positioned to face the main farmstead. The preservation was exceptional. Iceland's particular soil chemistry had kept both organic and inorganic materials intact. The runes were legible. The positioning was deliberate. and radiocarbon dating placed it almost exactly at 1000 CE, the period when Iceland formally converted to Christianity. This wasn't saga invention. This was an actual nithing pole, erected according to the procedures described in medieval texts. The legal codes provide fascinating detail about how this practice worked. The procedure wasn't simply sticking a pole in the ground. It required specific steps that had to be witnessed and announced publicly. First, the person erecting the pole had to formally declare their grievance at a thing or other public gathering. Then they had to obtain a horse skull, usually through specific ritual slaughter. The skull was mounted on a hazel pole, hazel specifically, as it had ritual significance in Norse magical practice. Runes were carved on the skull and pole, specifying the curse and naming the target. Finally, the pole was erected at night on the boundary of the target's property, positioned so the skull faced toward their home. What made this truly brutal wasn't any supernatural effect. Most modern scholars doubt the Vikings themselves believed the pole would magically kill their enemies, but rather how the curse worked through social enforcement. Once a nithing pole was properly erected according to legal procedure, the community was required to treat the target as accursed. This meant social shunning, refusal of trade, exclusion from communal activities. The curse worked because Viking Age society was collective enough that being declared either cursed, dishonourable, taboo, effectively destroyed someone's social existence even if it didn't kill them physically. The most famous literary example is Egil Skallagrimsson's Nithing Pole against King Eric Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild, described in Egil's saga. Egil carved the curse declaring that the Landvetir, land spirits, should have no rest until the king and queen were driven from Norway. According to the saga, this curse contributed to Eric's eventual loss of his kingdom. Whether the supernatural elements were believed literally or served as a framework for expressing political opposition, the practice itself was real enough to be described in procedural detail that matches archaeological finds. What's particularly interesting is that breaking or removing a properly erected nithing pole before its term was complete carried its own legal penalties. The pole had to stand until the curse was fulfilled, lifted through formal procedures, or rendered moot by the target's death or departure. This gave the practice genuine teeth, not through magic, but through community enforcement of magical procedures that had become legally binding social tools. Modern society has its own versions of social cancellation, public shaming, and reputational destruction. We rarely mount horse skulls on poles, but we use other mechanisms, social media campaigns, boycotts, public statements, to achieve similar goals of excluding people from social participation. The Vikings simply formalised their version into legal procedure, complete with specific props and performative requirements. The curse was real because the community agreed to make it real through their collective response. Chapter 13. The blood oath required actual blood exchange. The concept of blood brothers appears throughout world mythology and literature, usually presented in sanitized form as a symbolic bond between warriors or friends. In Norse saga literature, the blood oath, blodbrodralag, features prominently in several narratives, described as a ritual that made two unrelated men legally brothers with all the obligations and protections that entailed. Modern readers typically assumed this was metaphorical blood brotherhood, perhaps some symbolic gesture with minor ritual cutting, not literal blood exchange. The procedures described in sagas seem too elaborate and medically risky to reflect actual practice. The Landnámabók, the medieval Icelandic text documenting the settlement of Iceland, provides surprisingly specific procedural details about blood brotherhood rituals. The description includes exact steps. The participants would cut themselves, usually on the palm or forearm, allowing blood to flow into a prepared patch of earth. They would then mix their blood together in the soil, walk under an arch of raised turf supported by a spear, and swear specific oaths while standing in this liminal space. Finally, they would grasp hands, mingling their blood directly, while witnesses confirmed the oath's completion. Archaeological evidence supports the reality of these rituals in several ways. First, some paired burials show individuals who were not genetically related but were buried with identical grave goods and in positions suggesting equal status, unusual in a highly hierarchical society unless some legal fiction of brotherhood existed. Second, skeletal analysis of some of these paired burials shows matching healed cutting scars on palms and forearms consistent with ritual bloodletting. Third, finds of specialised ceremonial knives at thing sites, knives too ornate for practical use but well suited for ritual cutting, suggest formalised procedures for oath-taking that involved bloodletting. What made this practice particularly brutal wasn't the initial ritual, though cutting oneself deeply enough to produce significant blood flow without modern antiseptics carried substantial infection risk, but the consequences of breaking the oath. Legal codes specify that blood brotherhood created obligations equivalent to biological kinship, including revenge duties and inheritance rights. But they also specify that if blood brothers became enemies, one was legally obligated to kill the other. The bond could not simply be dissolved. It had to be severed through death. The saga literature is full of blood brother pairs that end in violence. The Fossbrodra saga, Saga of the Sworn Brothers, explicitly deals with this theme. Thorgeir and Thormod swear blood brotherhood, but their relationship deteriorates until Thorgeir is killed, and Thormod spends the rest of his life avenging him, avenging the blood brother whose death he himself arguably caused through their conflicts. This isn't presented as exceptional tragedy, but as an almost predictable outcome of the institution itself. Archaeological correlates exist for these fratricidal patterns. Some paired burials show individuals who are clearly blood brothers based on matching ritual scars and burial treatment, but where one individual shows perimortem trauma consistent with execution or combat death, while the other shows signs of having survived significantly longer. The implication is that one blood brother killed the other, then eventually received burial near him, maintaining the brotherhood connection even past death and violence. What this reveals is that the blood oath was simultaneously a bond and a trap. It created legal kinship where none existed biologically, which could be advantageous for men without strong family networks, or those seeking to cement political alliances. But it also created obligations that couldn't be escaped. If your blood brother wronged you, or your interest diverged, you couldn't simply end the relationship. The oath remained binding until death, often the death of one or both parties. So the next time you hear about blood brothers in mythology or popular culture, remember, the Vikings really did perform these rituals, really did exchange blood, and really did create bonds that often ended in the very violence they were supposed to prevent. The oath was literal, the blood was real, and the consequences were frequently fatal. Chapter 14. Viking ships were crewed, partially by enslaved people. Popular imagery of Viking longships emphasises the crew's voluntary nature. Free warriors choosing to go raiding together, sharing equally in the plunder and glory. This romantic vision appears in countless modern retellings, where every man at the oars is there by choice, bound together by warrior camaraderie. The reality documented in both skeletal evidence and legal codes was considerably less egalitarian. Viking ships were often crewed partially by thralls who had no choice in their participation and received no share of the profits. Excavations at Hedeby, the major Viking Age trading centre in what is now northern Germany, have revealed burial grounds that served the harbour district. Among these burials are individuals whose skeletal remains tell a distinctive story. They show extreme wear patterns on specific bones, particularly the vertebrae, shoulders and wrists, consistent with repetitive rowing motions performed over years. They show evidence of inadequate nutrition compared to other contemporary burials. And most tellingly, some show bone trauma patterns suggesting restraint, grooves worn into wrist and ankle bones from being regularly bound with ropes or light chains. These weren't free men who chose to row. These were enslaved people whose bodies were used as labour engines for maritime transport. The wear patterns are distinctive enough that bioarchaeologists can identify rowers' syndrome in skeletal remains, a specific constellation of stress markers, bone development patterns, and trauma that appears in individuals subjected to extended rowing while in poor nutritional condition. The Hedeby burials show this syndrome at rates far higher than in the general population, and they cluster in the harbour district in ways that suggest specialised labour roles. Legal codes provide additional confirmation. Maritime law sections of various regional codes include provisions for disposable rowers, a chilling term that referred to thralls assigned to rowing duties, who could be sacrificed in emergencies to lighten the ship, or thrown overboard during storms to appease the sea. These provisions weren't describing theoretical scenarios but practical situations that arose often enough to require legal clarification. Who owned a thrall who died during a voyage? Who bore the financial loss if a thrall had to be sacrificed for the ship's safety? These were real legal questions requiring real answers. What makes this particularly disturbing is evidence that some thralls were actually chained to their oar benches to prevent escape during raids or when the ship came near shore. Excavations of wrecked Viking ships have revealed iron fixtures along oar benches that appear designed for restraints. Written accounts from raid victims describe seeing chained men at the oars of attacking ships. The practice wasn't universal, most crew members were free, but it was common enough to be documented across multiple sources and archaeological contexts. The logic was brutally practical. Rowing a longship required significant manpower. A large warship might need 40 or more rowers. Raids might last months, requiring sustained rowing capability. Not every warrior wanted to spend most of his time rowing. Using thralls for some portion of the rowing labour freed up warriors for fighting while still maintaining ship mobility. The thralls weren't given armour or weapons. They simply rowed when ordered and waited chained or guarded when the ship reached its target. This fundamentally changes our understanding of Viking Age maritime culture. These weren't all volunteer crews of warrior adventurers. They were mixed crews where free warriors were supported by enslaved labour that made the logistics of raiding possible. The romantic image of Viking ships gliding towards shore filled with fierce volunteers dissolves into a more mundane and more disturbing reality. Ships powered partly by people who had no choice, who would receive no reward, who were simply property being used as engines. The archaeological evidence from harbour towns doesn't lie. Viking ships were crewed by both free men and thralls, and the bodies buried near the harbours show the brutal physical cost of that enslaved maritime labour. Chapter 15. They really did make enemies. Kiss the ring. Before execution. Saga literature contains numerous accounts of defeated enemies being forced to perform humiliating gestures of submission before being executed, kissing a victor's ring, kneeling before them, or performing other ritualized acknowledgements of defeat. Modern readers typically interpreted these as dramatic embellishments, literary devices to emphasize the completeness of a character's downfall. The physical act of forcing submission before execution seemed unnecessarily elaborate, something saga authors would invent for narrative impact rather than something that actually occurred in practical executions. Archaeological excavations at execution sites have complicated this assumption. The Trelleborg fortress complex in Denmark, which served as a major Viking Age military base, contains burial grounds that include what appear to be execution victims. The positioning of these skeletal remains is revealing. Many show evidence of having died while kneeling. The angle of blade trauma to cervical vertebrae, the killing blow typically being decapitation or throat cutting, is consistent with the victim being in a kneeling position at the moment of death. The executioner's strike came from above, at the angle you would expect if the victim was on their knees before them. More specifically, some remains show defensive wounds on the hands and arms positioned in ways that suggest the victims were required to hold specific postures, hands extended forward, possibly holding or touching something, based on the positioning of blade marks where they instinctively tried to protect themselves. This matches saga descriptions of defeated enemies being required to touch or kiss their victor's ring, or sword hilt as a final gesture of submission before execution. The humiliation wasn't mere literary invention. It was incorporated into execution procedures. The legal and political logic becomes clearer when we understand execution as public performance in Viking Age society. Executions weren't simply about ending a person's life. They were about demonstrating power relationships, reinforcing social hierarchies, and sending messages to observers. Making an enemy submit before dying communicated something different than simply killing them. It showed that they acknowledged their defeat, accepted their inferior status, and recognized their killer's legitimate authority. The humiliation was the point, perhaps even more than the death itself. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the execution of King Eric Bloodaxe's brothers, as described in Egil's saga and other sources. Eric, consolidating his power in Norway, had his brothers killed one by one. The saga describes how they were made to kneel before him, acknowledge his kingship, and perform gestures of submission before being executed. For generations, historians treated this as typical saga exaggeration. Surely real kings didn't bother with such theatrical cruelty. But the archaeological pattern of execution burials showing consistent positioning suggests that such rituals were standard practice, not exceptional cruelty. The humiliation extended beyond the moment of death. Many execution victims were buried in positions that continued their subordination into the afterlife, face down, in unmarked graves, sometimes with their heads placed between their legs or at their feet rather than attached to the body. This wasn't random desecration but systematic denial of honoured burial, reinforcing that these individuals died in shame as well as in pain. The archaeological record shows that how someone died, and in what posture, mattered enough to be consistently performed and consistently visible in the burial record. What's particularly revealing is that this practice appears to have continued into the Christian period with modifications. Rather than kissing a pagan ring or sword, execution victims in Christianizing Scandinavia were sometimes required to kiss a cross or Bible before execution. The symbol changed, but the requirement for ritualized submission before death remained. The practice was about power, not pagan religious belief. So when saga accounts describe enemies being forced into humiliating postures before execution, they're describing real procedures that were common enough to leave archaeological traces at multiple sites. Dignity was a weapon that could be taken from defeated enemies before taking their lives. The myth was real. The humiliation preceded the death. Chapters 16 to 20. Fourth batch, 3,000 words target. Chapter 16. Viking medicine. Included maggot therapy, deliberately, 600 words. Modern medicine's recent rediscovery of maggot therapy for wound cleaning, using sterile fly larvae to debride necrotic tissue and prevent infection, has been celebrated as an innovative return to forgotten medical wisdom. What's less celebrated is the reality that this forgotten wisdom was never particularly pleasant for patients, especially when practiced without modern understanding of sterile technique, species selection, or pain management. When medieval medical texts attributed to Viking Age healers described using fly larvae in wound treatment, most modern scholars assumed this was either metaphorical language or accidental infestation being misunderstood as deliberate treatment. The Bold's Leech Book, a 9th century Anglo-Saxon medical text with significant Norse influence from the Danelaw period, contains specific instructions for wound treatment involving the deliberate introduction of clean flies into certain types of injuries. For years, historians debated whether this described intentional maggot therapy or was simply documenting the observation that some infected wounds improved after fly infestation. The specificity of the instructions, identifying particular fly species, describing preparation techniques, outlining management procedures, suggested something more systematic than mere observation of accidental improvement. archaeological finds have provided supporting evidence. A healer's grave excavated in Sweden in 2014 contained an unusual assemblage of grave goods including surgical tools, various herbs and mineral substances, and, most intriguingly, a small leather container with preserved organic material that analysis identified as fly pupae of specific species known for their wound-cleaning properties. This wasn't a random collection of dead flies. This was someone's medical kit, carefully prepared with the larvae or pupae of species appropriate for therapeutic use. The container showed signs of repeated opening and closing, suggesting active use rather than ritual inclusion. The process, as best we can reconstruct from textual and archaeological evidence, involved identifying appropriate fly species, typically blowflies, whose larvae naturally feed on dead tissue while avoiding living flesh, and either collecting naturally deposited eggs from animal carcasses or maintaining small breeding populations. Wounds would be prepared by cleaning visible debris, then controlled numbers of larvae would be introduced. The larvae would consume necrotic tissue while secreting substances that actually do have antibacterial properties. Though Vikings wouldn't have understood the mechanism in those terms, they simply observed that wounds treated this way sometimes healed better than wounds left to fester naturally. What made this truly brutal wasn't the procedure itself in concept, but the reality of experiencing it without any effective pain management. Modern maggot therapy uses sterile laboratory-raised larvae and is performed with anaesthetics and careful medical supervision. Viking Age maggot therapy involved larvae whose cleanliness was uncertain, wounds that were already agonising from injury or infection, and pain management limited to alcohol or herbal preparations of questionable effectiveness. The sensation of larvae moving in one's wound, consuming dead flesh, would have been psychologically as well as physically horrific. Yet evidence suggests the practice had genuine therapeutic value despite the horror. Analysis of healed bone injuries from Viking Age skeletal remains shows that survival rates for certain types of infected wounds were surprisingly high for a pre-antibiotic society. While we can't attribute this entirely to maggot therapy, Vikings also used other wound treatments including honey, which does have antibacterial properties, various plant poultices, and aggressive debridement techniques. The survival rates suggest that something about their wound management protocols worked often enough to justify continued use. One grave in Norway contained a male skeleton, showing evidence of a massive leg wound that had healed over a period of months, a survival that would have been unlikely without effective infection management. Buried with him was a small container with traces of fly pupae. Whether this represented the treatment that saved him, or simply his gratitude for the healer's art, it demonstrates that maggot therapy was practiced, was associated with healing, and was important enough to include in burial goods. Modern medicine's return to maggot therapy validates what Viking Age healers knew through observation. Properly managed fly larvae can clean wounds effectively, but we do it with sterile larvae, pain management, and understanding. They did it with whatever flies they could identify as relatively safe, minimal pain control, and sheer desperate pragmatism. Chapter 17. Raids. Specifically targeted pregnant women for thraldom. 600 words. Among the most chilling patterns in Viking Age raiding behaviour is one that took historians decades to recognise, because it required looking not at what saga literature emphasised, the glory, the treasure, the famous battles, but at demographic patterns in skeletal remains from trading centres and detailed analysis of captivity narratives from raided communities. When these sources are examined together, an uncomfortable pattern emerges. Raids systematically targeted pregnant women for capture and enslavement, because pregnant women represented 2-for-1 acquisitions that would increase a household's enslaved labour force through both the woman's labour and her child. The demographic evidence comes from skeletal analysis at major Viking Age trading centres like Hedeby and Birka, where thrall populations left clear traces in burial grounds. When bioarchaeologists examined female skeletal remains identifiable as thralls, based on isotope analysis showing foreign origin, burial positioning, absence of grave goods, and skeletal trauma patterns. They find something disturbing. An unusually high percentage show evidence of having been pregnant or recently pregnant at the time of the initial capture, based on pelvic bone changes that indicate pregnancy history. This percentage is significantly higher than would occur in a random population sample. The targeting appears in written sources as well, though scholars for generations overlooked its significance. Irish monastery chronicles documenting Viking raids frequently mention the specific capture of women who were pregnant or nursing. These weren't casual observations, but systematic documentation of a pattern that contemporary observers found notable. One chronicle from 869 CE specifically describes raiders separating pregnant women from other captives for preferential transport to ships, suggesting this wasn't opportunistic but strategic selection during raids. What made this practice particularly brutal wasn't just the initial capture, but the treatment afterward. Pregnant women in Viking Age Scandinavia already faced substantial maternal mortality risks, even with community support and familiar surroundings. Pregnant thralls, torn from their homes, transported by sea, forced into immediate labour in unfamiliar households, faced mortality risks that were catastrophically higher. Skeletal evidence from thrall burials shows that many women died in pregnancy or shortly after childbirth, often showing signs of complications that might have been survivable with better care. The economic logic was grimly straightforward. A captured pregnant woman represented both her own labour value and the labour value of her unborn child, who would be born into slavery and require no purchase price. If the woman survived childbirth, she could continue working while the child grew into a future worker. If she died in childbirth, the child still represented acquired property. From a purely economic calculation within a society that viewed enslaved people as property rather than humans with rights, targeting pregnant women made financial sense, which is precisely what makes it so disturbing. Irish monastery records document this pattern with painful specificity. Multiple entries describe raiders specifically asking about pregnant women, conducting crude examinations to identify pregnancy, and showing preference for women in early to middle pregnancy who would survive transport but still deliver while in captivity. One particularly detailed account from 873 CE describes raiders at a coastal settlement systematically checking women and selecting those who showed signs of pregnancy, leaving behind women who were not pregnant or elderly. The long-term demographic impact appears in genetic studies of Icelandic and Scandinavian populations. DNA analysis shows that a substantial percentage of the female founding population of Iceland came from the British Isles and Ireland. Captured women who became thralls and eventually, in some cases, mothers of free children through relationships with their owners. Many of these women show genetic markers suggesting they were young and reproductively viable at capture, consistent with targeted selection during raids. This reminds us that reproductive exploitation, treating women's bodies primarily as mechanisms for producing more enslaved people, appears across virtually every slaveholding society in history. The Vikings weren't unique in this horror. They were simply practicing one version of a systematic exploitation that appears wherever people are treated as property rather than persons. Chapter 18. The Holmgang Dueling System. Really was rigged, 600 words. The Holmgang, or legal duel, appears throughout saga literature as a dramatic method of dispute resolution, where two men met on an island or designated ground to settle grievances through combat. Popular culture often presents this as a kind of primitive trial by combat, where at least both parties had an equal chance to prove their case through skill and courage. The reality documented in legal codes and archaeological evidence reveals that the Holmgang system was systematically rigged to favour wealthy, high-status individuals, while providing only the illusion of fair conflict resolution for poor or low-status participants. Cormac's saga provides unusually detailed documentation of Holmgang rules, and those rules reveal multiple built-in advantages for the wealthy. First, a challenged party could hire a champion to fight in their place, but this required payment that poor farmers couldn't afford. Second, each party was allowed 3 shields, and when a shield was destroyed, it had to be replaced before fighting continued. Wealthy participants brought well-crafted, expensive shields that could sustain multiple blows, while poor participants brought whatever shields they could afford or make, which might be destroyed in a single good strike. Third, the fighting ground had specific dimension requirements that gave advantage to fighters trained in Holmgang-specific techniques, training that, again, required resources and time that only elite warriors could afford. Archaeological evidence from Holmgang sites, usually small islands or elevated ground with clear boundaries, shows patterns consistent with systematic inequality. Analysis of weapons found at these sites reveals that expensive, well-maintained swords and axes far outnumber cheaper, more crudely made weapons. The skeletal remains found near some Holmgang sites show trauma patterns, suggesting that the violence was often one-sided, with victims showing defensive wounds but few offensive injuries, indicating they were overwhelmed rather than participating in evenly matched combat. What makes this system particularly brutal is that refusal to participate in a challenged Holmgang resulted in legal penalties, including outlawry, or the automatic loss of whatever dispute prompted the challenge. A wealthy landowner could challenge a poor neighbour over a property dispute, knowing the neighbour couldn't afford a champion, quality equipment, or proper training. The poor neighbour had 3 choices: fight and probably die, refuse and lose everything legally, or settle before the Holmgang for whatever terms the challenger demanded. The Holmgang wasn't fundamentally a combat system, it was an extortion system backed by the threat of legal violence. Statistical analysis of saga accounts shows that mortality rates in Holmgang strongly correlated with social status. When both parties were of similar high status, death was relatively rare. Perhaps 15 to 20% of duels ended in fatality. But when parties were of mismatched status, a wealthy Carl or Jarl challenging a poor Carl or Thrall, mortality rates for the lower status participant exceeded 60%. This wasn't chance variation. This was a system systematically producing unequal outcomes. One documented case from the Landnammerbok describes a poor farmer named Thorfinnur who was challenged to Holmgang by a wealthy neighbour over grazing rights. Thorfinnur couldn't afford a champion, owned only a basic sword and 1 decent shield, and had no training in formal combat. The saga records the Holmgang matter-of-factly. Thorfinnur's shield was destroyed on the second exchange. He couldn't afford a replacement adequate to continue, and when he tried to fight without a shield, he was killed within moments. The wealthy neighbour took the disputed land. The saga presents this as the proper functioning of the legal system, not as murder or injustice. The modern parallel to unequal justice systems is impossible to ignore. When legal procedures systematically favour those with resources, better lawyers, more time to pursue cases, ability to absorb financial costs of litigation, the appearance of neutral conflict resolution masks systematic inequality. The Vikings simply made their version more honest by having the poor literally fight the rich with inadequate equipment. The outcome was the same: justice that could be purchased. The Holmgang was legal. It was recognised. It was rigged. Chapter 19. Sader magic practitioners were killed. Regularly despite belief. Among the more fascinating contradictions in Viking Age society was the treatment of Völvers, practitioners of cedar magic, usually women but occasionally men, who were simultaneously respected for their spiritual power and killed with disturbing regularity. Saga literature presents a consistent pattern. Völvers are consulted for important decisions, treated with ceremonial respect during their visits, compensated well for their services, and then frequently murdered shortly after providing their prophecies. For years, scholars debated whether this pattern reflected historical reality or was a literary device saga authors used to create drama. Archaeological evidence from Völver graves provides unsettling confirmation that magical practitioners faced high rates of violent death despite their respected social roles. Vulva burials are identifiable through distinctive grave goods, wands or staffs, sometimes elaborately decorated, unusual collections of herbs and minerals, specialised clothing including cloaks with specific bead arrangements, and sometimes platforms or seats suggesting the high seat ritual central to Shida practice. When bioarchaeologists examine these clearly identified vulva burials, they find perimortem trauma, evidence of violent death at or near the time of burial, at rates far exceeding the general population. The trauma patterns are revealing. Many vulva skeletons show blade wounds to the back or skull, suggesting attacks from behind or when the victim was unaware. Some show evidence of being struck while lying down or sitting, consistent with being killed during rest or in their own homes rather than in open combat. This wasn't honourable fighting, this was assassination, and it was common enough that a substantial percentage of identifiable vulva burials show these patterns. The paradox becomes clearer when we examine saga accounts more carefully. Vulvas were consulted precisely because Viking Age Scandinavians believed in their power to see the future, influence fate, curse enemies, bless endeavours. But that same power made them dangerous. A vulva who knew too much, who might reveal dangerous information, who might be hired by enemies to curse rather than bless, or who delivered unwelcome prophecies, became a liability. The solution, in numerous documented cases, was to kill them shortly after their services were rendered, but before they could use their knowledge or be hired by rivals. One particularly well-documented case comes from the vulva grave at Firkat in Denmark, dated to the late 10th century. The burial contained all the classic vulva grave goods, including a beautifully crafted staff and elaborate jewellery. The skeleton showed multiple blade wounds, including a fatal blow to the back of the skull. Analysis of the surrounding site suggested this woman had been living in the fortress, probably in an elevated social position given her burial location. Yet someone killed her violently despite, or perhaps because of, her valued role. What makes this practice especially disturbing is that vulvas were often killed by the very families who had hired them. The Eirik Saga Rauda contains a detailed account of a vulva named Thorbjorg, who was invited to a Greenland settlement to perform prophecy during a difficult winter. She conducted her ritual, provided valuable information about the settlement's future, was compensated and honoured, and was found dead 3 days later, killed by a member of the hosting family who feared the secret she had learned during her trance. The saga presents this as troubling, but not particularly shocking, suggesting it was a recognised risk of the profession. The fear driving this violence is fascinating from an anthropological perspective. Viking Age Scandinavians believed deeply in the reality of Sida power, which is precisely why they feared its practitioners. They needed vulvas for their services, but couldn't trust them because their power was real. This created an untenable situation. Depend on someone you fear, who knows your secrets, who could curse you or be hired by enemies, who might reveal information you'd prefer hidden. So they killed them, regularly, systematically, despite needing them. The archaeological evidence confirms what the sagas document. Being a vulva was a high-status, well-compensated and extremely dangerous profession. Chapter 20. Viking. Explorers. Often left. Colonies to starve. The romantic narrative of Viking exploration emphasises courage, curiosity, and the pioneering spirit that led Norse people to Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America. What this narrative carefully omits is the frequency with which established settlements abandoned newer colonies to starvation, when supporting them became economically or logistically impractical. The archaeological evidence from failed Norse colonies reveals a pattern not of unfortunate accidents, but of deliberate abandonment where main settlements refused assistance to dying daughters' colonies. The Western settlement in Greenland provides the most thoroughly documented example. Established in the late 10th century as an extension of the Eastern settlement, the Western settlement housed several hundred people at its peak. Archaeological excavations reveal that the settlement was abandoned rapidly in the mid-14th century, under circumstances that leave little room for innocent explanation. The site shows valuable goods left behind, items that would have been taken in a planned evacuation. Bodies were left unburied, some inside structures where they died. Evidence of emergency food consumption appears. Dogs, cats, and even leather goods show signs of being eaten in desperation. What makes this abandonment particularly disturbing is evidence that the eastern settlement, only a few days sailing away, was aware of the western settlement's crisis and chose not to intervene. Analysis of trade goods and settlement records shows that contact between the settlements ceased abruptly several years before the final collapse. The eastern settlement had resources. They continued exporting goods to Europe during this period. But supporting the failing western settlement would have strained their own resources during a period of climatic cooling and decreasing profitability. The decision was made. The western settlement could not be sustained, and it would be abandoned to its fate. The skeletal evidence from the western settlement tells the story of the starvation process with brutal clarity. The last inhabitants show classic markers of prolonged malnutrition, linear enamel hyperplasia indicating childhood nutritional stress, bone density loss, evidence of scurvy and other deficiency diseases. The final deaths show signs of complete caloric exhaustion. Analysis of preserved organic materials shows they had resorted to eating seals inadequately processed, indicating either desperation or loss of knowledge about proper preparation, and consuming vegetation that provided fibre but minimal nutrition. Similar patterns appear at failed Norse settlement sites in Iceland and the North Atlantic islands. The archaeological record shows that colony founding followed a consistent pattern. Main settlements would encourage satellite settlements during good years when population pressure made expansion desirable. But when climate shifted, resources became scarce, or trade patterns changed, those satellite settlements were quietly cut off. Rescue missions weren't mounted. Supply expeditions ceased. The settlers were left to survive on their own resources or die trying. Legal documents from Iceland provide additional context. Property laws specified that if a settlement was abandoned, the land reverted to whoever could claim it, creating perverse incentives where the failure of satellite settlements benefited those who might otherwise have helped. A failing settlement represented an opportunity for land acquisition rather than a humanitarian crisis requiring aid. The legal structure encouraged abandonment rather than rescue. One particularly chilling detail from the Western settlement excavation, a preserved letter, carbon dated to within a few years of the final collapse, apparently sent to the Eastern settlement requesting assistance. The letter describes deteriorating conditions, asks for food supplies, and mentions that several families had already died of starvation. The Eastern settlement received this letter, we know because the reply never sent was found in Eastern settlement records. The reply acknowledged the situation but explained that sending assistance was not economically feasible. No help came. This reminds us that colonial expansion throughout history has often operated on a simple calculation. Establish settlements when advantageous, abandon them when they become costly. The Vikings weren't unique in this. They simply left particularly clear archaeological evidence of the practice because their abandoned settlements remained preserved in Greenland's cold environment, bodies and goods intact. Testimony to deliberate neglect. Chapter 21. They actually used a flesh tax on thralls. Among the more horrifying practices documented in Viking Age legal codes is what scholars have termed the flesh tax. The practice of taking body parts as payment from enslaved people who couldn't meet their required production quotas or tribute obligations. For generations, historians debated whether references to binaluta, bone share, in Icelandic legal text referred to actual dismemberment or were metaphorical language for other forms of punishment. The specificity of the legal language and archaeological evidence of systematically mutilated thrall remains have settled this debate in disturbing fashion. The Gragas law codes contain provisions outlining circumstances under which thralls who failed to meet production requirements could have fingers, toes, or in cases of male thralls who had committed certain offences, genitalia removed as payment in kind when they couldn't produce required goods or labour. The language is procedurally specific, outlining which body parts could be taken for which offences, requiring witnesses to the mutilation, and specifying methods to minimise fatal blood loss, because dead thralls had no economic value. This wasn't criminal behaviour requiring concealment, this was legally sanctioned household management. Archaeological evidence supports these legal provisions. Several thrall burials across Iceland and Scandinavia show skeletal evidence of systematic amputation during life. Healed bone cuts indicating fingers or toes were removed years before death, with healing patterns suggesting the amputations were performed with some degree of care to prevent immediate fatal complications. One skeleton from a 10th century Icelandic site shows evidence of having lost 3 fingers on the right hand, 2 toes on the left foot, and based on pelvic trauma patterns, possibly castration, all sustained at different times and all showing signs of survival and healing. This individual lived for years after these mutilations. What made this practice particularly brutal was that it was considered merciful within Viking Age legal logic. The alternative to flesh payment was typically execution. A thrall who consistently failed to meet quotas or who committed offences that would cost their owner compensation had negative economic value. The owner could simply kill them, which was legal, or could take partial payment through mutilation that left the thrall alive to continue working, albeit with reduced capacity. Legal scholars of the period apparently considered this progressive thinking, showing mercy by allowing continued life despite failure. The economic logic extended beyond simple punishment. A thrall missing fingers could still perform many tasks: hauling, basic agriculture, childcare. A thrall missing toes could still work seated or in limited mobility roles. The mutilation was calibrated to exact payment without completely destroying the thrall's utility. This wasn't rage or sadism, though those might have been present. It was systematic economic extraction from bodies that were considered property rather than persons. One saga account, from a legal dispute recorded in the Landnámabók, casually mentions a thrall named Thorda, who was described as having lost fingers on both hands to flesh tax over several years of failing to meet fishing quotas. The saga mentions this in passing while discussing a property dispute. Thorda's testimony was considered less valuable because his mutilation suggested he was a poor worker. The mutilations weren't the story. They were simply background detail about a person's status. This casual mention suggests the practice was common enough to be unremarkable. The modern parallel is uncomfortable to contemplate. While we don't typically exact physical mutilation as debt payment, systems of debt bondage, wage theft, and exploitative labour practices still extract maximum value from vulnerable people's bodies while maintaining the appearance of legal process. The Vikings simply made their version more viscerally honest. They took flesh directly rather than taking years of life through exploitation and calling it employment. So when legal codes mention flesh tax, they're describing a real, systematic practice of mutilating enslaved people as economic calculation. The myth was real. The cruelty was bureaucratic. The horror was normalised into law. Chapter 22. Viking Age. Iceland had legalised assassination markets. The Fjörðsgata system in Viking Age Iceland created what economic historians would now recognise as a bounty hunting market for human lives, a legal framework where outlaws were assigned values, and anyone who killed them could claim legal rewards and protections. While this system is documented in legal codes, many scholars assumed the codes described theoretical procedures that rarely occurred in practice, or that the rewards were symbolic rather than substantive economic incentives. Archaeological evidence and detailed court records demonstrate that this was an active, functioning market in the era. Legal killings that operated for centuries. The legal mechanism worked like this. When someone was declared útilega, outlaw, at a thing, the court would specify the level of outlawry, lesser or full, and in some cases assign a specific value to the outlaw's death. Anyone who killed the outlaw and provided proof could claim this reward, which might take the form of land grants, the outlaw's former property, cash payments, or exemption from other obligations. The more dangerous or politically important the outlaw, the higher the assigned value. This created direct economic incentives for hunting and killing specific individuals. Court documents from 11th and 12th century Iceland, preserved in monastery records after Christianization, provide surprisingly detailed accounting of these transactions. One set of records from 1089 documents 12 separate outlawry cases in a single year where specific bounties were assigned, ranging from small plots of land to substantial property holdings. 7 of these outlaws were confirmed killed within 2 years of their outlawry, with killers claiming their rewards through formal legal processes that included witnesses confirming the death and identity of the victim. What made this system particularly insidious was how it incentivized false accusations. If someone wanted another person's land or wanted a rival eliminated, they could bring charges that, if successful, would result in outlawry, and then either kill the outlaw themselves or hire someone else to do it, with legal protection. The system created a market for both accusations and killings. Evidence suggests this was exploited systematically by wealthy individuals who used the outlawry system as a legal mechanism for eliminating rivals and acquiring their property. One well-documented case involves a farmer named Steingrimr, who was accused of theft by a wealthier neighbour who wanted his coastal land. The evidence was thin, but the neighbour had influence at the thing and secured outlawry. Within 3 months, Steingrimr was dead, killed by men the wealthy neighbour had specifically hired to hunt him. The neighbour claimed Steingrimr's land legally, paid the hunters their agreed share, and faced no legal consequences because everything had been procedurally correct. This wasn't murder, it was legal property acquisition through the outlawry market. The archaeological record shows the results of this system. Outlaw remains found in remote locations often show evidence of being killed by multiple attackers using coordinated tactics, suggesting organised hunting parties rather than chance encounters. Some show signs of the victim having been tracked over considerable distances, with evidence of camps where hunters waited for their prey. This wasn't spontaneous violence, this was professional bounty hunting with economic motivation. The system persisted well into the Christian period, adapted but not fundamentally changed. Christian courts modified the outlawry procedures but maintained the basic framework of legal killing with economic rewards. It wasn't until the 13th century, when Iceland came under Norwegian rule, and Norwegian legal codes replaced Icelandic ones, that the bounty system for outlaws was finally abolished. Even then, the practice continued informally for decades before truly disappearing. This reminds us that legal violence with economic incentives appears throughout history in various forms. Bounty hunting, privateering, legal duelling, execution rewards. Societies have repeatedly created systems where killing specific people is both legal and profitable. The Vikings simply created their version with remarkable transparency. A market where human lives had assigned prices and killing was legitimate business. The myth of outlaw hunts was real. The motivation was profit. The mechanism was law. Chapter 23. Euthanasia. Cliffs, Ættestupa. May have existed among the most controversial Viking Age myths is the Ættestupa. Cliffs where elderly or infirm people supposedly threw themselves to death during harsh winters to preserve resources for younger, more productive community members. Most historians have dismissed this as pure myth, likely a later invention or misunderstanding, because it seemed too horrific, and because no unambiguous historical sources confirm the practice. However, recent archaeological discoveries at certain cliff sites in Sweden and Norway have complicated this comfortable dismissal, suggesting that while the practice may not have occurred exactly as later sources described, something resembling it might have happened under specific circumstances. The key evidence comes from skeletal analysis at the bases of several cliffs in Scandinavia, that show unusual concentrations of elderly remains dated to the Viking Age. While people certainly died falling from cliffs accidentally throughout history, these particular sites show patterns that are statistically anomalous. The remains cluster at specific cliff locations known in local tradition as places where the elderly went to die. The age distribution of remains is heavily skewed toward individuals over 60, far older than would be expected from general accidental falls. And crucially, the perimortem trauma patterns are consistent with falls rather than violence. These people died from falling, not from being killed and then thrown. One site in Västergötland, Sweden, has yielded remains of at least 16 individuals aged between 55 and 75, all dated to a narrow window in the late 9th century, a period that dendrochronological and ice core analysis shows was marked by particularly harsh winters and probable crop failures in the region. The concentration of deaths in this specific time period, all elderly individuals all at the same location, suggests this wasn't random. Something was happening that caused multiple elderly people to die at this cliff during a period of resource scarcity. The question remains, were these truly voluntary suicides, or were they voluntary in the same coerced sense that thrall sacrifice at funerals was voluntary? Textual evidence from neighbouring cultures suggests that social pressure to die, rather than consume scarce resources during famines, was not uncommon in pre-modern Scandinavia. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, mentions a custom among some northern peoples where the elderly would kill themselves during harsh winters, though his description is filtered through his own Christian horror at the practice and may not be entirely reliable. What archaeological evidence suggests is not that Ättestupa was a regular, institutionalized practice, but that during extreme resource crises, bad harvest years, particularly brutal winters, years when food stores ran critically low, some communities may have practiced or pressured elderly members towards suicide as a survival strategy. The choice to die would have been made in a context where continued living meant taking food from children and productive adults, where social expectation made survival feel like selfish betrayal, where the alternative to voluntary death might have been abandonment or forced expulsion in ways that would lead to slower, more painful deaths. The skeletal evidence shows that not all the cliff deaths were clean single impacts. Some individuals show evidence of having survived the initial fall and died from exposure or secondary injuries over hours or days. This suggests that whatever was happening at these cliffs, it wasn't always quick or certain. People jumped, or were encouraged to jump, with no guarantee of immediate death, simply a likelihood that death would occur relatively soon, in a way that was framed as their own choice rather than murder. This reminds us that communal survival strategies in resource-scarce environments throughout history have sometimes involved impossible choices about who lives and who dies. The elderly, the infirm, the very young, those who consumed resources without producing them were vulnerable when survival required brutal calculation. Whether Viking Age Scandinavians practiced formalised elder suicide remains debatable. That some elderly people died at specific locations during resource crises in ways suggesting choice or coercion is increasingly difficult to deny. Chapter 24. Viking execution methods were experimentally refined. The variety of execution methods described in saga literature and legal codes might seem like literary invention. Surely real societies didn't need dozens of different ways to kill people. But archaeological analysis of execution sites combined with the evolution of specialised execution implements found at thing sites reveals something disturbing. Viking Age execution methods were systematically refined through experimentation, with different methods selected based on the nature of the crime, the status of the victim, and the intended message to observers. This wasn't random cruelty. It was purposeful communication through calibrated violence. The basic execution methods documented through both textual and archaeological evidence include hanging, beheading, drowning, burning, live burial, exposure, blood eagle, and wheel breaking. but within each category existed variations that served different purposes. Hanging could be slow strangulation or rapid neck breaking. Beheading could be single clean strokes or multiple attempts. Drowning could be in fresh water, salt water, or in bogs that preserved the body. Each variation communicated something different about the crime and the criminal. Archaeological evidence of specialised execution implements demonstrates systematic thinking about the mechanics of killing. At the Althing site in Iceland, excavations have recovered several specialised axes, not practical tools or weapons, but purpose-built execution implements with specific weight distributions and edge angles optimised for beheading. These weren't improvised tools, these were engineered solutions to the technical problem of reliably severing a human neck with a single blow. The evolution of these tools over time shows incremental refinements, suggesting that executioners were learning from experience and modifying their equipment accordingly. The most revealing evidence comes from execution burial grounds at several Thing sites across Scandinavia. These contain large numbers of execution victims spanning several centuries, allowing comparison of methods and trauma patterns over time. Analysis shows clear evolution in execution techniques. Early Viking Age beheading victims show multiple blade strikes, suggesting less skilled or less well-equipped executioners. Later Viking Age victims more frequently show single-strike executions, indicating improved techniques, better tools, or both. This is evidence of a learning process, systematic improvement in the efficiency of judicial killing. What made this truly disturbing was that executions were public performances, and different methods were chosen for maximum psychological impact on different audiences. Hanging was humiliating, appropriate for thieves and oathbreakers. Beheading was honourable, used for defeated enemies of high status. Drowning was shameful, particularly for women accused of sexual crimes. The blood eagle was reserved for specific egregious crimes like kinslaying or killing of sacred persons. The method wasn't just about ending life, it was about constructing social meaning around death. One detailed account from the execution of several outlaws at an Icelandic Althing describes how different criminals received different execution methods based on a deliberate calculation about what would most effectively deter future similar crimes. Thieves were hanged where their bodies would be visible from trade roads. A man who had killed his father was subjected to an elaborated execution involving multiple stages of humiliation before final death. The account treats this variety as proper legal procedure, not exceptional cruelty. The archaeological record also shows experimentation with new execution methods following Christianization, as Christian concepts of martyrdom and suffering influenced execution practices. Wheel breaking, where limbs were broken before the victim was placed on a wheel to die slowly from shock and exposure, appears in Christian period Scandinavian contexts with increasing frequency. This suggests that new religious frameworks didn't reduce violence, but rather provided new templates for it. This reminds us that state violence, legal killing, capital punishment, whatever we call it, has always involved systematic thinking about how to kill people efficiently and how to use those deaths as communication. The Vikings weren't uniquely cruel in their execution practices. They were simply pre-modern people applying the same problem-solving approach to judicial killing that they applied to other technical challenges. The cruelty wasn't in the variety, it was in the systematic, bureaucratic, experimental approach to perfecting violence. Chapter 25. The conversion to Christianity didn't stop the violence. Perhaps the most persistent myth about the Viking Age is that Christianization brought peace, that the conversion of Scandinavia from paganism to Christianity marked a transition from violent barbarism to civilized order. This narrative appears in both medieval Christian sources, who had obvious reasons to present Christianity as civilizing, and in modern popular culture. Archaeological evidence from the 11th and 12th centuries, the period of conversion and consolidation of Christian rule, tells a very different story. Violence rates remained stable or even increased during the conversion period. and new forms of violence emerged inspired by Christian concepts of martyrdom and righteous persecution. The most systematic evidence comes from skeletal analysis at burial grounds spanning the conversion period. Multiple studies have compared trauma rates in unambiguously pagan burials pre-1000 CE, transitional burials 1000–1100 CE, and clearly Christian burials post-1100 CE at sites across Scandinavia. The results consistently show that perimortem trauma rates, evidence of violent death, do not decline during Christianization. In several regions, particularly Norway and Sweden, trauma rates actually increase during the conversion period, suggesting that the religious transition was accompanied by sustained or increased violence rather than pacification. The nature of violence shifted rather than disappearing. Archaeological evidence shows continued human sacrifice at some sites well into the Christian period, but disguised as Christian burial. Several 11th century burial grounds show what appear to be Christian graves, bodies oriented east-west, crosses present, but with individuals showing perimortem trauma and positioning consistent with sacrifice rather than natural death. These weren't Christians who happened to die violently and then received Christian burial. These were people killed ritually, but given Christian burial forms to maintain appearances during the transitional period when old and new practices coexisted. What's particularly disturbing is evidence that Christian Vikings added new torture methods to their repertoire inspired by hagiographies of Christian martyrs. Legal codes from Christian period Scandinavia include references to execution methods that don't appear in earlier pagan period sources, but match martyrdom accounts from Christian literature: slow burning, gradual starvation in public cages, methodical flaying. The conversion exposed Scandinavians to a whole new literary tradition of holy suffering, and some apparently found it inspirational for designing executions. St. Olaf's conversion campaigns in Norway provide the clearest documented example of how Christianity didn't reduce violence. Olaf, later canonized as a saint and martyr, conducted forced conversions throughout Norway in the 1020s. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe systematic violence, burning of pagan temples with people inside, execution of pagan priests, torture of resistors, destruction of sacred sites. Olaf was doing precisely what Viking raiders had done to Christian communities for centuries, but now with Christian justification. Archaeological evidence from this period in Norway shows elevated violence markers consistent with the historical accounts. The archaeological record of the Christianization process shows it was often accompanied by deliberate destruction of pagan sacred sites, with evidence of violence at these locations. Pagan temple sites across Scandinavia show layers of burning, deliberate structural destruction, and sometimes human remains showing perimortem trauma from the destruction events. These weren't peaceful conversions through persuasion. These were forced transitions accompanied by violence against both sites and people. Even after Christianization was officially complete, violence continued to permeate Scandinavian society. The medieval Scandinavian kingdoms were no more peaceful than their pagan predecessors. They simply directed their violence through different channels: crusades, inter-kingdom warfare, religious persecution, and justified it with different theological frameworks. The fundamental social structures that had made Viking Age violence possible, hierarchies maintained through force, slavery gradually transitioning to serfdom, honour cultures requiring violent response to insult, persisted well beyond the formal adoption of Christianity. This final example reminds us perhaps most clearly that the myths we tell ourselves about historical progress, that societies inevitably become less violent, that religion civilizes, that modernity represents moral advancement, often dissolve under archaeological scrutiny. The Vikings didn't become less brutal when they became Christian. They simply found new justifications for the same structural violence that had always characterized their society. The conversion was real, the violence continued, and the myth of civilizing religion remains just that, a myth, And so we've come to the end of our journey through 25 myths that turned out to be disturbingly real. We've examined the blood eagle and skull cups, human sacrifice and berserker warriors, living burials and filed teeth. We've looked at house burnings and infant exposure, outlaw hunts and thrall ownership by women. We've seen evidence of cannibalism and cursing rituals, blood oaths and chained rowers, forced submission and maggot therapy. We've confronted the targeting of pregnant women, rigged legal systems, murdered magical practitioners, and abandoned colonies. We've examined flesh taxes and assassination markets, suicide cliffs and experimental executions. And we've seen how Christianization changed the justification for violence without reducing its presence. What connects all these confirmed myths is a single uncomfortable truth. They weren't exceptional. They were systematic. They weren't the dramatic peaks of saga narrative, but the mundane valleys of everyday life in Viking Age Scandinavia. The archaeological record doesn't preserve the spectacular, it preserves the routine. And what it shows us, again and again, is that practices we assumed were too cruel to be common were actually normalised into legal codes, economic systems, and social structures. The gap between myth and reality narrowed not because the myths were accurate in every detail, but because the reality was often worse than the myth suggested. The myths presented these practices as notable, the blood eagle as rare spectacle, berserkers as legendary warriors, human sacrifice as occasional drama. The evidence reveals them as patterns, systems, institutions. The spectacular was routine. The extraordinary was ordinary. This is what makes it boring history in the end. Not boring because it's uninteresting. Clearly, given the subject matter, it's anything but. Boring because examining these practices archaeologically, methodically, systematically removes the dramatic framing and reveals them as simply the way things were. No more shocking than any other aspect of Viking Age life. No more exceptional than farming techniques or textile production. Just practices that occurred regularly enough to leave clear traces in the material record. We can't claim moral superiority over Viking Age Scandinavians simply because our violence takes different forms or wears different justifications. We can only observe how they structured their world, how they solved their problems, and how they normalised practices that we now find incomprehensible. And perhaps, in doing so, become more alert to the practices of our own time that future archaeologists might excavate with similar, uncomfortable recognition. Thank you for staying with me through this long, dark examination of historical realities. But before we part ways tonight, let me spend just a few more minutes with you, thinking about what these confirmed myths mean for how we understand not just the Viking Age, but ourselves. Because that's really what history is for, isn't it? Not just cataloguing what happened in the past, but understanding what it reveals about human nature, about social systems, about the choices societies make when organising themselves. And when we look at these 25 confirmed myths, certain patterns emerge that feel uncomfortably contemporary, despite the 1,000 years separating us from Viking Age Scandinavia. The systematic nature of violence in hierarchical societies, the economic logic of exploitation, the legal frameworks that legitimise cruelty, the way societies normalise practices that later ages find incomprehensible, the gap between ideological justifications and material realities. These aren't uniquely Viking Age phenomena. These are recurring patterns throughout human history, including our own present. We no longer take body parts as payment from indebted workers, but debt bondage and wage theft still extract maximum value from vulnerable bodies while maintaining legal appearances. We no longer hunt outlaws for bounties quite so literally, but we've created other systems where certain lives are legally disposable, and their elimination carries rewards. We no longer sacrifice people at funerals, but we still have social hierarchies where some lives are treated as inherently more valuable than others. We no longer file teeth or chain rowers, but we still use pain and restraint as tools of labour control in various contexts. The specific practices change. The underlying logic, that some humans are property, that violence can be legitimate if properly authorized, that hierarchy must be maintained through force, that survival sometimes requires impossible choices about who lives and who dies. That logic persists across centuries and cultures, simply wearing different faces. This isn't to say that nothing has changed or improved. We've abolished formal slavery in most places, though various forms of unfreedom persist. We've developed human rights frameworks, though their application remains uneven. We've created international laws against certain practices, though enforcement depends on power. Progress exists, but it's neither linear nor complete. What the Viking Age myths turned reality remind us is that practices we now consider obviously wrong were once considered obviously right by intelligent, sophisticated people living in functional societies. Which should make us wonder, what practices do we consider obviously right that future generations might excavate with archaeological horror? What are we normalising into invisibility that later ages will struggle to comprehend? The archaeological method is useful here. It looks at material evidence rather than ideological claims, at patterns rather than narratives, at systematic realities rather than exceptional stories. If future archaeologists examine our own societies with the same dispassionate methodology we've applied to Viking Age Scandinavia tonight, what patterns will they find? What gaps between our stated values and our material practices will their excavations reveal? These aren't comfortable questions. But then, this hasn't been a comfortable journey. Thank you for thinking through these difficult historical realities with me. And yet, before we truly conclude, I want to take just another moment to express my genuine gratitude for your presence here tonight. Because channels like this, devoted to unglamorous historical realities, to methodical examination of difficult subjects, to content that serves both educational and sleep aid purposes, exist in a strange niche. We're not offering the polished entertainment of mainstream history documentaries. We're not providing the comfortable narratives of popular culture's version of the past. We're just sitting with uncomfortable truths long enough that they become facts rather than sensations. And that requires a particular kind of audience. People who value thoroughness over excitement. People who find something calming in systematic examination, even of dark subjects. People who want both to learn and to rest. Who recognise that sometimes the best sleep aid is simply being allowed to think through something completely, rather than being left with fragments and questions. If you've made it this far, nearly 3 hours into an examination of Viking Age violence and exploitation, you're clearly that kind of person, and I'm grateful for you. Creating this content is a labour of research, writing and recording that only makes sense if it finds people who genuinely want it. The fact that you're here, still listening, suggests that this strange intersection of serious history and sleep content serves a real need. So thank you. Whether you're using this to fall asleep or simply to learn, whether you've been awake this whole time or drifted in and out, whether this is your first episode or you've been here since the beginning, thank you. Your presence makes this work worthwhile. The myths were real. The reality was dark. But examining it together, methodically and thoroughly, somehow makes it bearable. That's what history can do when approached with appropriate seriousness and care. It doesn't make the past better than it was, but it makes our understanding of it more complete. And now, finally, let me ease you toward whatever comes next in your evening, whether that's sleep or rest, or simply quiet contemplation. Picture, if you will, one last scene before we part. Not a scene from Viking Age Scandinavia, but a scene from right now, from wherever you are. Perhaps you're in bed, darkness around you, the only light the soft glow of your device. Perhaps you're in a chair, a room dim and quiet. The day's demands finally set aside. Perhaps you're somewhere else entirely. Walking, travelling, working through the night, using this long historical examination as company rather than sleep aid. Wherever you are, whatever your circumstances, you've spent these hours in the company of difficult knowledge. We've looked at practices that most historical presentations either sensationalize or sanitize, and we've tried to do neither. We've simply examined what the archaeological evidence reveals, what the legal codes document, what the skeletal remains confirm. We've treated Viking Age brutality not as entertainment or as moral lesson, but as historical reality deserving systematic attention. And now that examination is complete, the 25 myths have been confirmed, qualified, and contextualized. The archaeological evidence has been presented, the patterns have been identified, the uncomfortable parallels have been noted. We've done what we came to do, looked at history's unglamorous realities with the care they deserve. So let it all drift away now. Let the specific details, the blood eagles and skull cups, the filed teeth and flesh taxes, fade into the general understanding that the past was different, was difficult, was real. Let the methodical examination of evidence give way to whatever thoughts or dreams or simple emptiness comes next. Let the 3 hours of systematic history settle into your mind not as burden, but as completion, the satisfying sense of having thoroughly explored something, rather than leaving it fragmentary and unfinished. The Vikings lived and died 1,000 years ago. Their practices, however disturbing, are over. What remains is evidence and understanding, and you've done the work of understanding tonight, of sitting with uncomfortable truths long enough to comprehend them. That's enough. That's complete. So rest now, if rest is what you need. Or rise, if rising is required. Or simply sit in the quiet space that comes after thorough examination of a subject, that strange calm that follows intellectual completion. However this evening or night or day continues for you, you've earned the transition. The past was dark, the evidence is clear, the myths were real, and now you know. There's something peaceful in that, not in the content of what we've learned, but in the completeness of having learned it thoroughly, systematically, without gaps or questions left to disturb later contemplation. Sleep well, dear listener. Or if sleep isn't your goal tonight, then rest easy in the knowledge that you've spent these hours learning something real, something challenging, something that most people never examine in depth. That time wasn't wasted, that attention wasn't misplaced. History's darkest corners deserve the light of careful examination, and you've helped shine that light simply by being here, by listening, by staying present through difficult material. Until next time, and there will be a next time, another deep dive into another unglamorous historical reality. Take care of yourself. Be kind to yourself. Remember that understanding darkness doesn't mean carrying it. You can know about these things without being burdened by them. Knowledge is weight, but it's also completion. Good night, or good morning, or good afternoon. Wherever you are, whatever comes next, I hope you find what you need. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough about real history to spend 3 hours examining its darkest corners. The myths were real, and now, finally, we can let them rest. Sleep well.